The man who once inspired Barron Trump was now at rock bottom. What happened next will amaze you. The rain was relentless, turning the streets of Indianapolis into a maze of shimmering puddles. Barron Trump pulled his hood tighter over his head, hoping to shield himself from the icy droplets. It was supposed to be a quick stop, just a detour on his way to a meeting. But fate had other plans. As he crossed the corner of Market Street, his eyes locked onto a figure sitting under the awning of a closed diner. The man's cloth were worn and layered awkwardly, as if he'd pieced together warmth from whatever he could find. He was holding a cardboard sign, the words hastily scrolled, "Fallen on hard times." Anything helped. Something about the man's face seemed familiar, but the recognition didn't strike immediately. Barron slowed his pace, curiosity pulling him closer. Despite the cold, it wasn't until he stood just a few feet away that the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. It was Mr. Harrow. Barron's mind raced. Mr. Harrow, his 8th grade history teacher, had once been a towering figure of intellect and kindness. He was the man who'd made ancient civilizations feel like gripping stories and instilled a deep love for learning in a young Barron. Seeing him now shivering and worn felt almost surreal. Mr. Harrow. Barron's voice cracked more from disbelief than the chill in the air. The man's head snapped up. His eyes, bloodshot and weary, searched Barron's face. There was a moment of silence. As the teacher's expression shifted, the faintest flicker of recognition breaking through his exhaustion. Barron, his voice was hoarse, but there was no mistaking the disbelief laced within it. But before either could say more, the weight of what lay between them, years' circumstances in this moment, hung heavy, demanding to be addressed. Barron stood frozen, rain still drizzling around him, as memories of middle school rushed back like a flood he could hold back. Mr. Harrow had been more than just a history teacher. He was the kind of educator who made students feel seen, heard, and valued. Barron recalled the first time he'd walked into Mr. Harrow's classroom at Greenfield Academy. The walls were lined with vibrant maps, timelines, and quirky historical facts. Mr. Harlow himself was an animated storyteller, weaving tales of ancient empires and forgotten revolutions with such vivid detail that it felt like stepping into another world for Barron, who often felt like he lived in the shadow of his famous last name. Mr. Harrow's classroom had been a refuge, a place where ideas mattered more than anything else. One memory stood out. It was the day Barron had delivered a class presentation on the fall of Rome. He'd been so nervous, his hands shook as he gripped his cue cards. Mr. Harrow had noticed, of course, and had walked over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Take your time, Barron," he'd said with a smile. "You've got this, and remember, every great leader had to start somewhere." That simple encouragement had meant everything to him. It was Mr. Harlow who taught him to believe in himself, to think critically, and to take pride in his efforts. Barron couldn't count the number of times he'd left that classroom feeling a little taller, a little more confident. But now, standing here on a rainy street corner, Barron struggled to reconcile that memory with the reality in front of him. Mr. Harlow wasn't the larger-than-life figure he remembered. His clothes were tattered, his hands weathered, and his once commanding presence was diminished by exhaustion and despair. "Mr. Harlow," Barron repeated softly, stepping closer. What happened to you?" The teacher hesitated, his gaze dropping to the wet concrete. He didn't answer immediately, but the weight of his silence spoke volumes. Barron could sense there was a story here, one far more complicated than he could have imagined. "I'm sorry, Barron," Mr. Harlow finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would recognize me anymore." But Barron couldn't just walk away, not from the man who had once been his greatest mentor. Something deep inside him stirred, compelling him to stay and find out the truth. Barron stood frozen, rain still drizzling around him as memories of middle school rushed back like a flood. He couldn't hold back. Mr. Harrow had been more than just a history teacher. He was the kind of educator who made students feel seen, heard, and valued. Barron recalled the first time he walked into Mr. Harrow's classroom at Greenfield Academy. The walls were lined with vibrant maps, timelines, and quirky historical facts. Mr. Harlow himself was an animated storyteller, weaving tales of ancient empires and forgotten revolutions with such vivid detail that it felt like stepping into another world for Barron, who often felt like he lived in the shadow of his famous last name. Mr. Harrow's classroom had been a refuge, a place where ideas mattered more than anything else. One memory stood out. It was the day Barron had delivered a class presentation on the fall of Rome. He'd been so nervous his hands shook as he gripped his cue cards. Mr. Harrow had noticed, of course, and had walked over, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "Take your time, Barron," he'd said with a smile. "You've got this, and remember, every great leader had to start some, where that simple encouragement had meant everything to him." It was Mr. Harrow who taught him to believe in himself, to think critically, and to take pride in his efforts. Barron couldn't count the number of times he'd left that classroom feeling a little taller, a little more confident. But now, standing here on a rainy street corner, Barron struggled to reconcile that memory with the reality in front of him. Mr. Harlow wasn't the larger-than-life figure. He remembered his clothes were tattered, his hands weak, and his once commanding presence was diminished by exhaustion and despair. "Mr. Harrow," Barron repeated softly, stepping closer. What happened to you?" The teacher hesitated, his gaze dropping to the wet concrete. He didn't answer immediately, but the weight of his silence spoke volumes. Barron could sense there was a story here, one far more complicated than he could have imagined. "I'm sorry, Barron," Mr. Harlow finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think anyone would recognize me anymore." But Barron couldn't just walk away, not from the man who had once been his greatest mentor. Something deep inside him stirred, compelling him to stay and find out the truth. Barron's decision to help Mr. Harlow was immediate, but the path forward was anything but clear. The first challenge was getting his former teacher to agree. Mr. Harlow hesitated, glancing down at his weathered boots as if ashamed to accept the offer. "Barron, I don't want to be a burden," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. "You're not a burden," Barron insisted, his tone unwavering. "You're someone who mattered to me and still does. You didn't give up on me back then, and I'm not giving up on you now." That seemed to strike a chord slowly. Mr. Harlow nodded, allowing Barron to help him to his feet. They walked together toward Barron's car, a silent understanding passing between them. Once they were out of the rain and seated in the warmth of the car, Barron began to formulate a plan. He wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't a problem that could be solved overnight. But he also knew he couldn't leave Mr. Harrow to fend for himself any longer. Barron started small, taking Mr. Harrow to a nearby motel where he could get a hot shower and a proper bed for the night. As Mr. Harrow stepped into the room, he paused, his eyes scanning the modest space. "It's been years since I've slept anywhere that wasn't a shelter or the street," he said softly. Barron's heart clenched, but he didn't let the emotion show. "Get some rest," he said, handing Mr. Harlow a few essentials he'd picked up from a nearby store. "We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." The next day, Barron began tackling the bigger challenges. He reached out to local organizations for assistance, but it quickly became clear that resources were limited, and navigating the system would be a maze. He also realized that Mr. Harrow's lack of identification would be a significant obstacle. It was nearly impossible to secure housing or employment without it. Why does it feel like everything is designed to keep people down once they fall? Barron vented during a phone call to a homeless outreach center. The woman on the other end offered a kind but sobering reply. "It's not easy, but people like you stepping in make all the difference," encouraged but determined to do more. Barron took to social media, sharing a heartfelt post about his former teacher story. He hoped to connect with former students or anyone willing to lend a hand. Within hours, the post gained with hundreds of likes and comments flooding in old classmates. Reached out, some sharing their own stories of how Mr. Harlow had impacted their lives. Offers to help started trickling in, some small, others more significant, but not everyone was supportive. Barron faced criticism from those who accused him of using his privilege to play hero. Others questioned why he was helping just one man when so many needed assistance. The negativity stung, but Barron reminded himself why he'd started this journey. He also had to contend with Mr. Harrow's own doubts. There were moments when the former teacher seemed overwhelmed by guilt and shame, questioning whether he deserved this second chance. Barron stayed patient, reminding him of the man he used to be, the one who had inspired so many young minds. If it's not about what you've lost, Barron said one evening, it's about what you still have to give. But even as progress began to take shape, Barron knew the hardest part was yet to come. Convincing Mr. Harlow to believe in himself again. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of small victories and unexpected challenges. Barron worked tirelessly, balancing his personal commitments with his determination to help Mr. Harlow rebuild his life, slowly but surely. The pieces began to fall into place. One of the first breakthroughs came when Barron managed to secure a meeting with a local nonprofit focused on helping homeless individuals reintegrate into society. They agreed to assist Mr. Harlow in obtaining replacement identification documents, a critical step toward finding stable housing and employment. Though the process was tedious, it marked a significant turning point. With Barron's encouragement, Mr. Harlow also began attending group therapy sessions offered by the nonprofit. These meetings were difficult. At first, opening up about his struggles was an emotional and painful experience. But with each session, Mr. Harlow seemed to reclaim a small part of himself that had been buried under years of hardship. One evening, as they sat in Barron's apartment, reviewing job listings, Mr. Harlow suddenly looked up. "Do you think I could teach again?" he asked, his voice tentative but hopeful. Barron smiled. "Why not? You were born to teach, Mr. Harlow. Let's make it happen." They started small. Mr. Harlow began tutoring at a local community center, offering free classes in history and writing for underprivileged kids. Watching him interact with the students was like seeing a spark reignite. His confidence grew with each lesson, and soon parents and staff began singing his praises. It wasn't long before the center offered him a part-time teaching position. But the most poignant moment came a few months later. At a community event hosted by the center, Mr. Harlow was invited to give a speech about his journey, standing before a crowd of students, parents, and supporters. He spoke candidly about his fall from grace and the people who had helped him back up. "I thought my story was over," he said, his voice steady but emotional. "But what I've learned is that every chapter, no matter how dark, leads to the possibility of something new. And it's never too late to rewrite the ending." The audience erupted into applause, and Barron, standing at the back of the room, felt a lump pour in his throat. For the first time in years, Mr. Harlow looked like the man Barron had admired so deeply. Proud, confident, and full of purpose. After the event, Mr. Harlow approached Barron, his eyes glistening with gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You gave me back my life. You gave me so much more." Barron replied, "This was the least I could do," but Barron knew the real victory wasn't just in helping Mr. Harlow, it was in seeing how one of kindness could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what he could have imagined months past. And Mr. Harlow's transformation became a testament to the power of second chances. He had gone from living on the streets to inspiring a new generation of students, proving that no matter how far someone falls, there's always a way to rise again with the right support and a little faith. For Barron, the journey had been as life-changing for him as it had been for his former teacher. The experience opened his eyes to the struggles people often face, silently hidden behind smiles, or in Mr. Harlow's case, weathered faces on city streets. It reminded him that everyone has a story, some waiting for a new chapter to be written. As they sat together one sunny afternoon at a park near the community center, Barron couldn't help but reflect, watching Mr. Harlow laugh with a group of students who hung on his every word. He realized just how much impact a single decision could have. One act of kindness, one moment of stepping outside your own comfort zone to help someone else could ripple outward in ways you'd never expect. This is what you were meant to do, Barron said with a smile as Mr. Harlow walked back over to join him. You were always meant to teach. Mr. Harlow nodded, a quiet pride shining in his eyes. And you were always meant to lead, Barron. Never doubt that the story of Mr. Harrow and Barron Trump became an example for others, inspiring countless people who heard it to look beyond the surface and offer a helping hand. It wasn't about heroics or grand gestures. It was about seeing the humanity in others and believing in the power of change. To everyone watching, Barron left one final message. If you see someone struggling, don't turn away. You never know how far a little compassion can go. Sometimes it's not just about helping someone else. It's about rediscovering your own humanity in the process. And so, as Barron's story reminds us, even the smallest act of kindness can create a chain reaction of hope, redemption, and purpose. So if this story moved, you take a moment to reflect, to share, and to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the best in humanity.